So I'd like to do a couple of introductions before we get started tonight. I'm really excited to introduce you to these people. So the first is Brian Walsh, one of our speakers tonight. I was first introduced to Brian actually when I read one of his books a few years ago. And from that point on, I was very intrigued about what he would have to say and some of his ideas. I knew he had cool things to say. So in the past few years, apart from him being an author of many great books, the most recent of which is called Beyond Homelessness, which some of you may have heard of given tonight's topic. I also got to know Brian in some of his other capacities that he serves in, most notably as a Christian Reformed campus minister at the University of Toronto campus, where he's also professor at Wycliffe College, which is an Anglican seminary there. And I got to know him as pastor of a unique community called Wine Before Breakfast Community, which is a weekly gathering for communion early in the morning. So that's a really cool community, and I was thankful to be a part of it last semester. If you want to know anything about justice, subverting the empire, Bruce Cockburn, or organic farming, Brian's your guy, so talk to him. And secondly, our other presenter tonight is Kevin Coghill. Kevin is the director of the Life Center here in downtown Guelph and a pastor of Royal City Church. So at the Life Center, his ministry reaches out to folks who are on the margins here in Guelph, and they do that through programs such as Agape Cafe, which provides warm meals for up to, you were saying, about 100 people a night, right? Which is really, really important ministry, so we're thankful for that. And I've also heard that he is a musician and a visual artist, and you may have seen some of his art downtown Guelph. So that's cool too. And finally, Jamie Vanderberg is a campus minister here, part of Guelph Campus Ministries, and he will be facilitating the discussion tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Jamie. Thank you.
So you're not actually going to hear that much from me. I'm going to jump up once in a while to ask a question. I won't interrupt the presenters, but we're doing this completely as a conversation. So you're not going to hear lecture. We've come up with a number of questions together. There's 6 or 7 questions that we're going to give the two of these guys an opportunity to respond to, and then we're going to open it up to you in a very casual way. You don't have to text in, you don't have to come to a microphone. If you speak loud enough, we should be able to hear your questions, and we'll just continue the conversation about justice and Jesus. So you'll see me come up and ask more questions. But we're going to get things started, and we're going to get things started with a fairly in-depth question. We're going to jump right into the meat of things, and we're going to start with a question: what do you think Jesus and justice have to do with one another? And I'm going to invite you, Brian, to get us started on that one.
Well, we're going to do rock, scissors. Okay, let's do it anyway. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, geez. 1, 2, 3. Oh, yeah. 1, 2, 3. Dang, I'm on. Okay. We didn't rehearse that. We really didn't. Jesus and justice. Jesus who? Well, how about if we start with Jesus the Jew? Let me start there. Pretty simple observation. Jesus is a Jew. When the question gets asked, who do men say I am? I tell you a story here. A number of years ago, I engaged in an act of radical inhospitality, an act of NIMBYism. There were people moving into my neighborhood, and we organized to tell them they weren't welcome. The people were the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan moved into Riverdale in downtown east side of Toronto, and we organized the churches to protest, and we marched against the Klan, basically saying, your racism is not welcome in our neighborhood. And when we got to the park where we were going to meet and have speeches and music, it was this great community gathering. So we had reggae bands and folk musicians, and we had labor unionists and feminist movement, and all kinds of people speaking. And as we're all speaking, just getting a little uncomfortable because it was the churches that organized this, and nobody from the churches were speaking yet. And then Sister Bernadette was welcomed to the stage. Sister Bernadette, the pastor of that United Faith Apostolic Church of Latter-day something or other, that little black gospel church on the corner that I walked by on a Sunday night, and they were just rocking in there. And I never walk in because I'm just way too white to walk into that place. And Sister Bernadette, she's going to come and speak to the crowd. And I remember thinking, oh no. I mean, this Pentecostal lady, she's just going to get up and preach the gospel or something. You know, and I realized afterwards that my oh no was both sexist, racist, and probably educationally elitist. Because here's what she said. I can tell you her whole speech. When Jesus came to Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, who do men say I am? They said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets. And who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Messiah of God. And Jesus said, Peter, God has revealed this to you. And upon you, you are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against the church of Jesus Christ. And I've come here to tell you that the Ku Klux Klan are the gates of hell, and they will not prevail against the church of Jesus Christ. And she walked off the stage. And I thought, now that's the gospel. That's the gospel. Here she spoke into the situation of racism, into the situation of the Ku Klux Klan moving into her neighborhood. And she identifies the Ku Klux Klan as the gates of hell, and says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church of Jesus Christ. What Peter said was, you are the Messiah. That's a Jewish term. The Messiah is the one that they longed for and waited for. And the Messiah was the one who would come to do justice. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus knows what the prophet Micah said. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love mercy, and to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly before your God. To do justice. The Torah of Israel is summed up at one point where the Torah says, justice and justice alone you shall seek. Justice is part of the warp and woof, is part of the very essence of Judaism. And when Jesus comes as the Messiah, he comes as the embodiment of justice. One last thing. Also at the heart of Israel's understanding of how life was supposed to be structured was a vision of justice that meant that all needed to have equal opportunity. All needed to have the justice in terms of the resources to live their life to the fullest. So when injustice emerged, as it always will, the Torah of Israel has a legislation called Jubilee. And Jubilee is something that happens when all the slaves are set free and when all of the land is returned back to the original owners. And when Jesus shows up in Nazareth, his own hometown, they hand him the scroll, they hand him the scriptures. And he finds a place in the scroll, he finds the Isaiah scroll, and he finds a place in the scroll where it's written this. And he reads this out loud. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to proclaim the year of Jubilee. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. And the eyes of everybody in the synagogue are on Jesus. Man, this guy could wax eloquent on that one. This rabbi could preach for hours and hours on that one. That's what we've always wanted to hear. We've always wanted to hear that Jubilee's going to come. We've always wanted to hear that the oppressed will be set free. There'll be good news for the poor. There'll be liberty to captives. That's what we want to hear. living here in Nazareth under Roman rule in the midst of the empire. That's what we want to hear. We want to hear about a good news. We want to hear gospel. What's Jesus going to say? He says, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That's it. His sermon was shorter than mine. Jesus and justice. Over to you, man.
What he said. So Jesus as one of the parts of the Trinity, right? You guys are all familiar with the Trinity thought. I like the thought of the Trinity. I never figured out. But one of the things that I like about the Trinity is when they were trying to describe the parts of the Trinity, they used the word persons, right? The persons of the Trinity, and that really doesn't do very much justice until you realize that the word persons came from the Greek plays when people used to use masks, and that became their persona, and it was sort of a different mask or something like that. But then that word persons, so the persons of the Trinity, came on to take on this meaning of someone that could love outside of themselves, not for who the person they were loving was, but for who they were. So we're looking at this part of the Trinity that loves outside of himself, not because of who we are, but because of who he is. And if you go back and through the Old Testament, you see some of these things. And just like today, Brian got introduced as this amazing guy, an author, a speaker, and he is a great speaker and a great author. And that's what identifies Brian. And I got introduced as an artist and a musician and a pastor, and that is sort of what identifies me. And if you look through the Old Testament, starting in the Old Testament, God is identified as the father of the fatherless, and all through scriptures. He's identified as one who brings justice. And yeah, it's that simple.
Now, both of you have used the word justice a lot. So we're going to take a step back. What the heck is justice?
Mm-hmm.
It's your turn, man.
My turn to go first. Shoot. Well, I was looking at justice actually a little while ago and trying to figure out actually what does that mean, because to me justice looks like Jesus touching people that nobody else wants to touch, and eating with people that his friends tell him he shouldn't be eating with, and I think that's true. But there were two words that were used in the Old Testament, and I'm not going to try to pronounce them. I don't have any Greek training, but there were two words that were used, and the first one was for justice. It was sort of used in the fact of like equity, or if you went to court, everyone was supposed to be treated the same. Whether you were rich or poor, the judgment shouldn't come down any differently to you than it would anyone else. So it's sort of based on that sort of principle. The other word for justice, though, was actually right relationship, good relationship. And that's probably what I will talk more about tonight than anything, is relationship as justice. And so there's this kind of two things going on. There's equity and right relationship. And I think equity creates right relationship, right? Because there is no hierarchy. In fact, the only hierarchy is God. We're all beneath him, and that's the only. So to me, the justice is equity between everyone and right relationship with others and with God.
Well, what he said. Yeah, I think that's right. That the justice is about right relationships, and I think the words you were probably thinking were mishpat and tzedakah. Mm-hmm. And mishpat is the word that's usually translated as justice, and it basically means equity. It basically means fairness. I watched Lincoln the other night. I decided that my daughters needed to see this film, if only to see Daniel Day-Lewis act, who's such an incredible actor. And Tommy Lee Jones plays Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens was a radical Republican, and back then the Republicans were the more progressives, and the Democrats were the reactionaries. And Stevens was pushed on the floor of the House of Representatives to say whether the 13th Amendment, the amendment that said that all were equal, including and therefore slavery should be outlawed. He was pushed to. They were going to push him, say, "Do you really want to say that all are equal, and therefore all should have the vote?" that Negroes should have the vote, why then the women will want the vote too. Do you really want to say that? And Stevens did want to say all that, but he knew that if he said that, the whole thing would collapse. So in a moment of rhetorical flourish, he looked at the Democrat across the hall from him, and he said, "You nincompoop, of course I don't believe in equality like that, because your stupidity shows that you are not equal to anybody else in this house." Right? And he said, "I'm talking about equality before the law." And Lincoln later on comments on the Euclidean formula that if things are equal in relation to one, in one relation, they were equal in all relations in a mathematical formula, and which of course means equality before the law means equality in all things. So Mishpat is about that sense of equality, that sense that what happens in the courts needs to be something which is done with fairness and with equity, right? Which of course is a very important thing to say, because that's never the way it works in courts, right? That's never the way it works. The way it always works is you get the one with the most money gets the most justice, right? The one who gets the best lawyer gets the best shot at justice. And the one who can bribe in the gates in the ancient system is the one who gets justice. And Israel says, no, justice is a matter of equity. But it's an equity precisely for the sake of right relationships. So the notion of justice then is connected in a Hebrew way of thinking with the notion of shalom. And shalom isn't just the absence of war. That's not what shalom means. That's not what peace means. But rather, shalom is this rich, rich concept in Israel's thought that has to do with right relationships across the board, right relationships between human beings, between the genders, right relationships between human beings and the rest of creation, right relationships between the human beings and God, and indeed right relationships within ourselves. That's shalom. That's wholeness. Justice is about making sure that the conditions are there so such wholeness can flourish. If somebody doesn't have a house, they do not have shelter, then there's certain conditions of wholeness, certain conditions of flourishing that are stripped from them. If they don't have access to food, there's certain conditions of wholeness that are not available to them. I was in Nicaragua during the Contra War, and we were in a resettlement camp. And at a certain point, the commandant of the camp wanted to talk to these Canadians who were in his camp. So we went over to the house where he was, and the whole community, 250 folks who were displaced and living in this camp, followed us. And he looked outside and he thought, I don't want to talk to these white folks in front of all these folks. So he sent out the new policeman. And the policeman came out and he gave a speech. And his speech basically said, from now on, if anybody is caught stealing corn, the full weight of the law will come down upon you. And a little old lady at the very back of the room called out, is it against the law to steal corn if you are hungry? And she knew that the Nicaraguan government had just passed the first constitution in history that said the right to food was a human right. And she knew that if she was hungry, that a right was being transgressed here, that she was being denied a right. So justice is about right relationships, but right relationships requires rights. So justice is a matter of securing other people's rights, guaranteeing their rights. It was just Martin Luther King Day last Monday. And King once said this. He said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think what he was saying was profoundly true. So it's not just that justice is something that we create, or we create the conditions for, which we do. We create laws, we create institutions, we create relationships, we create communities in order to facilitate and encourage justice. We're called to do that. But I think King was saying that as part of the very fabric of the universe, that there be justice, that the universe bends towards justice. And I think the answer goes back to what Kevin started with. It goes back to God. The arc of the universe bends towards justice because God, the creator of all, the one who creates all in love, the one who creates all in order for there to be flourishing, in order for there to be shalom, this God is fundamentally a God of justice. So justice is built into the fabric of the universe. Yeah,
Can I respond to that? Can I respond? So you spoke about rights and like having rights as part of that. But us, sometimes as privileged, we think our rights keep us here, and sometimes it might mean us losing what we think are rights to bring other people's rights up to level, right? Like this isn't a system we're bringing everybody up to North American standards, middle class or higher. This is about an equaling.
That's absolutely
right.
That's right. I mean, the other thing that is simply assumed throughout the Bible, is that if there is wealth beside poverty, then injustice has happened. If wealth exists beside poverty, somebody is being oppressed. That is simply an assumption of the Old Testament. The Old Testament isn't against wealth. It's for flourishing. It's for wholeness. It's for fruitfulness. It's for prosperity even. We can use that word, it's been so bastardized. You know, it is for a fulfillment of all of life. But that fulfillment of all of life has to be within the context of right relations. So if you have a society in which the conditions are right for the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer, which would be our society. I mean, all the numbers point that way. That the numbers in the top percentage can continue to rise, and the numbers in the lowest percentage continue to rise. So the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. If you have a society where the structures are set up that way, then there is injustice. That justice is a matter of a communal sense of flourishing. And maybe that's one of the problems with the rights language too. When I talk about rights, I know that a lot of our talk about rights are rooted in Enlightenment thought, right? The rise of individualism in the Enlightenment gives us the sense of the rights of the individual. I think that the scriptures do appreciate and affirm the rights of individuals. But I think those rights of individuals are always within the context of community. It's always within the context of community so that there is a sharing of abundance. In the Sabbath year, the Jubilee year is the 50th year. When you have 7 Sabbaths, 7 times 7 gets 49, then the 49th year is a Sabbath year, and then the 50th year is another Sabbath year. It's the Sabbath of all Sabbaths. But when on the Sabbath year you would release a slave, you would not only release your slave, but you would send them away with something from your flock, a sheep. I'm a farmer. We just had a calf born on Monday night. I got pictures. People bring pictures of the children. I got a picture of Finnick, our little bull calf. You send your slave away with an animal, and you send the slave away with grain from your granary. Why? So they can start again. It's giving them the resources to start again. They can plant, and they can raise this goat or this cow, or whatever it is, for milk. They can make a deal with the neighbor to breed it, so they can have more animals. It gives them the opportunity to start again. But also, you need to go to your wine stock and send them home with wine too, so they can celebrate, of course. so they can have a party, because justice is about bringing about such joyfulness in human life.
I'm going to jump in there and note that shalom gives me shivers. It's an incredible concept, but it hasn't always materialized in Israel's history, and it certainly hasn't materialized in our own world. So what are we supposed to do with all the injustices that the church is still involved in today?
Repent. Repent. And I guess we also need to ask ourselves the question, how did that ever happen? How did it ever happen that a church, a community that has its origins in the radical message of Jesus of Nazareth, a community that in the first century would be the community where all the orphaned children would show up. People often complained about those early Christian communities that they were sort of noisy affairs because all the kids were always running around. A community where they said there is no distinction between male and female, slave and free. We've got this radical community in the first century. You got a community that if there was an illness that had come into a city and it was clearly contagious, we have evidence that people would leave and Christians would come. This radical community. A radical community that as far as we know, refused military service in the first 150 years or so. And then somehow this community gets co-opted by the empire. And somehow this community all of a sudden finds ways to provide religious legitimation for the greed of the empire and the violence of the empire. The community all of a sudden becomes, it moves from the margins and becomes powerful at the center and becomes sort of the chaplain of the empire. And in the same process, historical process of the church selling out to the empire, the church also learned Greek, and learned Greek really, really well. The terms we've been using here are all Hebrew. They're terms rooted in Israel's scriptures that take seriously that when Jesus even speaks Aramaic and when the New Testament writers speak in Greek, they are speaking as Jews out of this rich Jewish tradition. But within about 2 generations, they began to think in other kinds of terms. It's called Hellenism. They began to think in terms of dualisms, where there's a distinction between the spiritual dimension of life and the physical dimension of life, between the religious and the secular, between church and state. And once you start setting up a dualism that way, then at a certain point, really matters of justice, matters of justice become narrowed down to something called justification by faith. Right? Instead of matters of justice being matters of setting things right in community and being justified in Jesus being a matter of being invited into being an alternative community in the midst of the empire, justice becomes something that has to do with an individual's relationship with God through Jesus, and that's all. So this kind of a dualism ends up creating a space for Christians to live good, pious lives that at the same time function to legitimate all kinds of violence. Of course, the great example would be the conquistadors, coming to the Americas and bringing slaves with them, and the symbol of the cross being held forward, and the symbol of the cross then functions not as a symbol of how God brings about justice through his own sacrifice, but becomes a symbol of the church in the name of European power coming to create a sacrifice, and the sacrifice of slaves and the First Nations of the Americas.
The question again, Jamie, was?
Jesus and justice, why have they been so divorced from each other? What's so amok with our church, given the beautiful picture of shalom? We're not there, in other words.
I've wondered a lot about whether or not it's about the big C church and the little c church, right? Like the church as institution, because around the world, in pockets, there's great things happening in the church, in the body of Christ. There is, and there's always been. There was a reporter one time that got to like a world disaster and like from a big paper, big like Time or something, and said, "Man, can't we get here once before the Christians? Just once." They want to get there before justice happens when Jesus moves people. It just does. Right? And so it's always been there. I just think it gets lost in the institution. And maybe we need to have a reformation of the institution for more of that to happen. But maybe that's how we teach our children what a church is, right? Like most of us think that church is going on Sunday morning, and it's that place we go to. But it's what we do during the week with each other that is justice. Right? That becomes church. And I don't know if that affects things still. I
think that's a really important point that you made, which is an important correction to what would seem like a blanket condemnation of church history. There are always movements within the church, renewal movements, revival movements, movements of monasticism that St. Francis, for example, where there are these times in the church where, to use kind of theological language that Kevin and I would be comfortable with, the Spirit is moving. And when the Spirit moves in the church, justice starts to happen, and the church reaches out to its poorest neighbors. So during the Wesleyan revivals, for example, it was simply an assumption that if you heard Wesley preaching, and you decided that yes, you were going to come to Jesus, the assumption was that if you came to Jesus by hearing the gospel preached, that meant you also joined up for the emancipation of slavery. The two things just go together. They have to go together. John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, who was a slave runner, when his life gets turned around, he then joins forces with Wilberforce to bring about the emancipation of slavery. So these things go together. Well, here's the weird thing. It didn't happen with the Billy Graham revivals. Just didn't happen. The Billy Graham revivals was a significant movement in the latter half of the 20th century. Millions upon millions were getting saved, as it were. But you did not see emerging immediately out of those type of revivals movements for justice. You did not see Billy Graham marching with Martin Luther King Jr. You didn't see the white evangelical Christians and those revival movements getting beat up by the police when they marched for equal rights for blacks in America. They weren't there. And that, I think, is an incredible tragedy.
I live sort of in the two worlds of sort of the parachurch. So if you're not familiar, Brian has spoken at some of these amazing conferences called Street Level, and it gathers frontline workers from across Canada, like 400. And we see the church happening there. We see justice. Yeah. It's amazing what's happening across Canada when people follow through with justice that Jesus talks about. But I walk this weird line of a pastor in a church and being involved in this frontline ministry. And some Sundays, you guys don't tell anybody in my church, some Sundays I feel it's my job to protect the church from the people that come in because our guests come. That's a sad thing. But if it's not there in the church and people don't get to see it and they don't get to be part of it, how will it ever change, right? If we subtract it, that was one of the things that I found. It's hard about the parachurch sort of thing. When you pull stuff out of the church, how do the people in the church that say they know Jesus, how do they begin to act like they should begin to act? So we can't separate that. It has to merge closer together than spread farther apart. It's a horrible line to walk for me. I find that that's the worst part of my position, is straddling that line.
Let me tell you a church story. Is my friend Katie in the room? Just wave, Katie. You're not here. Okay, fine. I'll tell her father she can come. Church that I was part of in Toronto for a long time, it's called Church of the Redeemer, downtown, has a vibrant ministry, including a lunch program every day with the homeless. And they don't generally come to church, right? They're there they're in the building more than the church folks are. It's kind of their building more than the church folks. And I remember one day, a guy came in off the street for church, and he was clearly a homeless guy. He clearly had mental health issues, and as he sat down, I saw John Sutton get up and walk over and sit down beside him. And nothing surprising about that. This guy, John Sutton, had the gift of hospitality. If you were new in our church, John Sutton was going to sit beside you, make sure you could find your way through the service and figure it all out, right? So John is sitting with this guy, and John is a developer. He's wearing a $1,000 suit. He lives in Rosedale. He is a wealthy guy. He's a wealthy guy with the gift of hospitality. And he understands justice. He understands the way the system works, and he does certain things that he can do to try and change the system. At a certain point in the service, we came up for communion, and we're in a big circle. And John comes up with this guy, and the guy starts to weep. And John holds him. And this guy's weeping into John's $1,000 suit. And John's just holding him. And when I said to John at the end of the service, Jesus came to church this morning. Twice. Jesus came to church, he was that homeless guy. And Jesus came to church, he was John Sutton holding that homeless guy. You know, that's a very, very visceral experience of a very personal justice.
I want to continue on that personal line here. What makes you want to follow Jesus, and how does that drive you towards justice in your own life?
That's me. Okay. What makes me want to follow Jesus? I could just say hope. The difference that, I can only compare for myself what life was like before and what was after meeting Jesus, right? And many Christians will tell you that, when you meet Jesus, you're going to get lots of money, you're going to get a nice house, you're going to meet the right woman, all things are going to fall in line. And you know what happened with me? My ex took my son and I never saw him. I could only see him every other weekend. I was taken to court and charged extra money for child support that I didn't have, and none of that stuff happened. The difference that for me wasn't situational, it was in the situation there was hope and possibly what shalom maybe, that I had some shalom with God, some peace with God. And so for me it's the hope. And then when I see people that have no hope, finding a little bit of hope is what drives me. In everybody. And there's hope in everybody, no matter what they say, no matter how many times I get a call about suicide, there's hope somewhere. Or they wouldn't be calling about suicide. And so the difference and what drives me is just finding that hope. I used to think that as a person that was serving others, I was going to go and save them. And I was going to bring salvation. And that was going to be awesome. And little did I know, like Brian said, that I met Jesus, that the person in front of me became Jesus. And I began to learn to see differently. And so for me, my walk with God and with Jesus is about a more exciting life, about something that happens underneath. That when I do meet with someone that's weeping and I see Jesus, that's exciting. When I have to scrub the walls from explosive diarrhea at the center, and I can imagine that I'm really just kneeling at the throne of Christ, that drives me. So it's that hope that's just always there.
I was reflecting on this actually this morning, because I preached this morning at our community wine before breakfast on the passage which says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. I got to think about what it means to be saved. And somebody actually said to me after the service, thanked me, and she said, a lot of us have post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder because of the language of being saved. That they've experienced this language as in fact very oppressive in their lives. But I was thinking about it because I was thinking about my own experience. I became a Christian when I was 16 years old through something called the Yonge Street Mission, downtown Toronto. And the reason I became a Christian was first off because there was something about these people that I met running a coffee shop in the basement, a coffee house in the basement of a very grungy soup kitchen ministry to the homeless and the destitute of Toronto. There's something about the quality of the people that I met in the basement of that place on Friday and Saturday nights in 1969 that was just incredibly compelling. So I first met Jesus embodied in what we call the body of Christ. So there's this community of people, and they are engaging in a ministry of hospitality and love to kids like me down in the inner city from the burbs, on the weekend. But they're also doing it within the context of a ministry to the poorest of the poor. And somehow them reaching out to me as a middle-class kid and then reaching out to the inhabitants of the downtown are of one piece. And they didn't bother me about Jesus because I told them to lay off the Jesus stuff. And then one night somebody said, hey, why don't you read this? And it was a little booklet called Good News According to John. And it was the Gospel of John. It wasn't named Four Spiritual Laws. It wasn't a tract. It was simply the Gospel of John. And I went home, bought some Chinese food on the way, sat and started eating my Chinese food. And by about 2 in the morning, I had read the Gospel of John. I wasn't much of a reader then. I flunked grade 9. And I read the Gospel of John, and I got to the end of it, and I thought, that's why these people are the way they are. Because they're following the Jesus that I meet in this story. And I wanted to, it's almost like I'd already joined. I already joined the community. I felt this was a place that could be a place of home for me. And really that's what I was looking for most profoundly. I wasn't looking for somebody to forgive me for my sins, because I didn't know that I was such a bad sinner and that God was so pissed off anyway. I mean, that just wasn't part of what I was thinking. What I knew was that there was something about the monotony of suburban life that couldn't cut it for me. I knew there was something about simply thinking that my life would be to climb the corporate career ladder to I don't know where, that wasn't cutting it for me. There was something about the sense that this whole culture is going nowhere. And there's also, on a very personal level, the fact that I didn't have a father. That was there too. Didn't have a father who loved me. See, here I am feeling pretty darn homeless, living at Keele and Lawrence in Toronto, feeling that I don't have a place there. And then I meet a community and think, that feels like home. And then I read about Jesus. he's the guy making home here. He's the guy inviting people home. And so I prayed that night. Simple prayer. God, if you're there, I want to know. Good night. Good night. See you then. Though you're not God. We were never triple that. And I woke up in the morning and I knew. And I began to follow Jesus. And I still follow Jesus, and I follow a Jesus who is profoundly committed to justice. Because the Jesus that I met was a Jesus on Yonge Street in downtown Toronto. And he's still there. He's also at the University of Guelph.
We had another question, but I'm actually going to just invite Kevin only to respond to that question and then take questions from you. And so Kevin, I want you to just share one story of justice as you've seen it unfold in downtown Guelph.
Okay.
One story. And then we're going to take questions, so be prepared.
I'm not going to give a specific story. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We talked already about rights and about equity. And I'm going to tell you how I've experienced justice. Because we had talked about how sort of some of us have to come down in our privileges so that others can come up in their rights. And I also mentioned that I had this mentality that I was coming to save people. It's interesting when you let go of your power, let go of your, I don't want to say let go of your faith, but let go of any sort of preconceived notion of what you're going to do with someone. And you sit across the table from someone, and you really begin to see that we're not all that different. No matter what their state of life is, no matter where they slept last night, no matter if they just came from the addiction center or if they just came from the mental hospital, or whether or not they've had their children taken by CAS, or whether or not they're a sexual predator. And you can find Jesus in a sexual predator. That's when I begin to see justice. And it's not about me sharing with them, but it's about equality. I'm there with them. You know, God is about incarnation stuff, right? Like, he left heaven, Jesus left heaven, came to earth to be with us in the crowd. And just being with someone in that, I experience justice. I don't know that that person always experiences justice, but I experience justice because I see how much better it is when there's an equal playing field. And the table, for some reason for me, a table, maybe the communion table, but a table in particular seems to represent justice for me. To be able to sit across the table from someone and eat and drink is a beginning for justice for me. I don't have a specific one for you, but I experience that regularly.
The table. It's all about the table. It really is. I mean, when we started Wine Before Breakfast, it's called Wine Before Breakfast, and our caption on our posters were, what else would you expect from a glutton and a drunkard? That's what they call Jesus, a glutton and a drunkard. He's always having a party. He was always eating. They ran out of booze, he made more. People don't have lunch, well, let's make lunch. You know, the food is always at the heart of the whole thing. And that's why a ministry of feeding people is so, we do not live by bread alone, but we need bread. But the ministry of feeding people is such a rich ministry. Because you're not just feeding their body, you're inviting them into community. And that's also why I think that the communion table is such an important table. It's the communion table is where, in my understanding of things, all are invited. The only criteria that I have for people coming to the communion table at Wine Before Breakfast is this: are you hungry? Because if you're hungry enough to come for that little piece of bread and that little sip of wine, then that's a deep hunger. That's a deep hunger. We'll have breakfast afterwards. We can feed you more. But are you hungry? Because if you're hungry, then this is the table. Come here.
I'm going to open it up for questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, on the subject of justice and the church in the past having committed injustices, recently the Prime Minister of Canada apologized for our nation's treatment of the First Nations, bearing in mind that his administration or he himself had nothing to do with it, but he's part of an institution, and I think you're seeing where I'm going with this analogy. As Christians, as part of the church, and as an institution, do you feel the need to shoulder responsibility to apologize not only for past injustices, but injustices that are going on currently?
Yeah, that's part of
What does that look like? Sorry.
Yeah, that's part of what repentance means. But yes. I confess my cynicism of Prime Minister Harper's apology, because nothing in his administration since has demonstrated that it was a sincere apology. In terms of nothing has changed in how the Indian Act is administered and how the First Nations are treated. But yes, when I spoke at U of T on with the Ecology Club, and they had different traditions, and people who spoke just before me were First Nations, and then I was asked to give a Christian perspective on ecology. I began by turning to the First Nations sister and brother who were in the room, and I began with an apology. So yes, I think that the apologies matter. I think that there's ways in which you need to shoulder responsibility as well. So, for example, those who are in mainline churches, especially United Church, Anglican, and the Catholic Church, that were complicit in the residential schools, where there again the church was the handmaiden of the state to engage in acts that were essentially of cultural genocide, even before any of the sexual abuse started. The very notion of these residential schools was an act of cultural genocide. And when the Anglican Church settled on some of the legal cases around that, and it meant that a number of dioceses were going to go bankrupt, the church as a whole said, the Diocese of Toronto had nothing to do with this, but the Diocese of Toronto will shoulder the financial cost of this. And our church, Church of the Redeemer, I remember our priest getting up and saying, we have been assessed, what was it, $20,000 from our congregation that needs to go to this fund. And she said, and I think we can do better. I think we should do 40. And in 2 weeks we raised $40,000. That was an act of saying sorry. It was also an act of solidarity with the church beyond our immediate borders.
Do you want to get in on that, or do you want me to just open it?
Keep going.
Next question. Yeah.
So we've been talking about like the connection between Jesus and justice and what that looks like. I was wondering if you think it's possible to live a just life without Jesus, without religious belief, and if so, what that looks like, how that would compare to the type of justice that we've been talking about for the past hour or so.
Yeah. Do you want to start with that?
Sure. I'm not sure that, I'm not, on a worldly scale, I think people can live just lives if we were going to measure it on a world scale. I'm not so sure that the thing that happens is we are all made in the image of Christ. So God comes into it no matter how you look at it. But I'm not sure that I can be who I'm supposed to be without Christ. And so that's a big factor in how I respond in justice. Yeah.
but I think that the difficulty is, Kevin, that we have all kinds of examples in our own time and throughout history where the folks who were leading the cause of justice in the most creative and courageous ways were in fact not Christians, and often had to do it over against the church, had to fight Christians for the sake of justice. So that reality in itself demonstrates that you don't have to be a Christian to seek justice. Gandhi sought justice. Now, Gandhi also thought very highly of Jesus, but Gandhi sought justice and engaged in radical and creatively nonviolent acts to achieve justice. So yeah, I think one can, and I think that the way in which I would theologically think about that would be to agree with Kevin. We're all made in the image of God, and some of us, for one reason or another, find ways to better image God than others. Find ways of justice. Well, how? Christians say, how could they do that if they haven't heard about Jesus? And I think that the answer comes from Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And people who are in touch, through perhaps even other religious traditions, in touch with the nature of the world, can be in touch with the nature of justice and can in fact practice justice. And I think that it's it would be, I'm trying to find the right word, it would be ungracious and ungrateful to try and say, well, no, they don't. Whereas it's clear that they do, and the Christians have much to learn from them. Anybody ever heard something called Urbana? You ever heard of Urbana? Okay, the university folks are in the room. Okay, so Urbana is this huge missions conference that University Christian Fellowship runs, and I went to Urbana in 1970. And in 1970, at this Christian missions conference, students were segregated. There was a black residence and there were white residents. It was at a Christian conference in 1970. They were segregated. There are mission organizations from all over the world, a couple hundred of them. So folks went and surveyed them and asked the question, do you accept African Americans as missionaries? 80% of them said no. They wouldn't accept African Americans. Well, they published those results. The place almost blew up. And Tom Skinner, who was a black evangelical leader at that time, preached. And I remember what he said. You can remember Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was he a Black Panther, Mark? Yeah, so Stokely Carmichael was a Black Panther, radical black revolutionary. And here's what Tom Skinner said. God will not be without a witness. And if the Church of Jesus Christ will not witness to justice, then God will raise up Stokely Carmichael to do it for him. And I think that was profoundly true.
I see two questions, so we're going to start with names.
I love to hear a female voice, because I'm getting bored of him. I'm not saying that she can't talk.
I just want to confirm something that you said previously, just so I don't put words in your mouth. You said something to the extent that Christianity and the banishment of slavery pretty much go hand in hand or synonymous.
During as part of the Wesleyan revivals.
Okay. So how do you explain how in Exodus, Leviticus, Luke, numerous other passages in the Bible promote slavery?
Great question. Great question. I don't think that anything in the Bible promotes slavery. I think that in Leviticus, precisely the year of Jubilee legislation, the dark side to that legislation is that in the 50th year, all of your Israelite slaves had to be released, but not foreign slaves. You could keep your foreign slaves. So, well, how come? Well, because they're not part of the covenant people. There's a clear in and out kind of distinction. So it's all right to keep Egyptian or Philistine or Assyrian slaves, but it's not all right to keep Jewish slaves. Let me just continue reading what I read a few minutes ago from Luke. So Jesus gets up and he proclaims this message of Jubilee. And then he says, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Isn't this Joseph's boy?" So they're all saying, "Wow, great sermon." Short, too. Great sermon. This is what we want to hear. He's come to proclaim Jubilee. Liberation of those who are captive, and that's us. And then he picks a fight with them. "Doubtless you will quote to me the proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself,' and you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we heard you did in Capernaum.'" Like, how about a few miracles, Jesus? One word, one sentence sermon, fine. Well, how about some miracles? And here's how he says, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown," counter to what just seemed to happen. "But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine in all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow of Zarephath in Sidon." All kinds of widows dying in Israel, but the prophet Elijah doesn't save any of them, but goes to this pagan widow in Sidon. "There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." Who's Naaman? Naaman was the Osama bin Laden of the day. Naaman was a terrorist who stole Israelite children and took them as slaves. And he comes as a leper, and Elisha heals him. Now, these are not the favorite bedtime stories of the good folks of Nazareth. These are not the stories you tell your kids to go to sleep, because these aren't good stories. These are stories of weird things where God is saving folks who he ought not be saving. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up and drove him out of the town and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. What Jesus is doing there is he's fulfilling and he's correcting Leviticus. Leviticus says Jubilee is for Jews and Jews only. Jesus comes along. He says, "I proclaim Jubilee." They say, "Yeah, amen, we like that." And they push him a little bit, and he pushes back. He says, "Well, guess what? Let me tell you 2 stories of people who were received the blessing of God, received healing from God, while God did not save Jews. And they are pissed. They want to kill him." Essentially what I think Jesus is saying there is, the year of Jubilee is now for all. So he's expanding Jubilee so that all slaves need to be set free. So then we get to the question, well, what about Paul? Paul in Colossians will talk about slaves, and it would take me too long, but I think that what Paul is doing in Colossians is he is in fact undermining slavery. And he undermines slavery in a very interesting twist of his language. At a certain point, he's talking about slaves, obey your masters because you have a master. The word master, as in Lord, it's the same word, kurios. Slaves, obey your master because you have a master. So why should I obey my master? Because he's not really your master. Your real master is your master in heaven. And then he uses a very interesting word. He says, "For you know that you will receive an inheritance from your master in heaven." An inheritance. When do slaves ever get an inheritance? Slaves don't get an inheritance. They are the inheritance. They're part of the property that gets passed down. Yet Paul here says, no, slaves receive an inheritance. And I think that what we should hear whispering there is Jubilee. When do slaves get inheritance? When the slaves are released from bondage and slavery in Egypt. The Exodus is a time when slaves receive inheritance. And Paul says, and earlier he said there is neither slave nor free. He's already undermining the very structures of slavery. So I think the New Testament is against slavery. And then, if you read Colossians, you get to the end of it, and you find out that there's a guy, Archippus, who's part of the community. And then you turn a couple pages to a little letter called Philemon. And Philemon is written to Philemon, Aphia, Archippus, and the church in your house. It is the church in Colossae. So Paul has actually sent another letter. And in the letter to Philemon, it's about a runaway slave, Onesimus, who comes with the letter to the Colossians. And in that letter to Philemon, if they're wondering, what exactly was he saying here? We have a problem in the room. We have Philemon sitting at the front here. We have Onesimus at the back. Onesimus is his runaway slave, and under Roman law, he has 4 options here. 1, he could have him killed, because for a slave to run away is a capital offense. 2, he could have him branded on the forehead as a slave, and that way he could never be free. 3, he could receive him back and forgive him and keep him as a slave. Or 4, well, 4 is unimaginable. He could let him go. Paul goes for option 4 in his letter to Philemon. He says, you want to know what I'm really talking about in the letter to the Colossians? Let your slave go free. So I think that the New Testament is actually anti-slavery. The church was not, especially when the church once again got in bed with empire. So I think that the church ends up subverting the radical nature of its own gospel. That was a little complex, but there it is.
Next question. Oh, John.
Sure.
Yeah. That was the other.
I'm not a female voice, but
It's true. Let me give that one. Plus, I'm going to give precedence to students. Questions from anyone in the audience, especially students?
Since the topic is justice, I was wondering about the first sin.
Could you speak just a little louder?
I was wondering about the first sin in Christianity, how Adam sins, right? And then God punishes everybody because of that, because the genetic. So how do you explain this justice? One person is sinning and everybody's punishing for it.
Yeah. I don't think it's genetic. I don't think that some people actually argued that. No, it's just too weird. I won't even tell you that. I don't think it's genetic. I think there's a sense of a solidarity of all humanity, and that Genesis story is a story. It's a founding story. In the classical sense, it's a myth. C.S. Lewis would call it. It's a true myth. It's a foundational story that is going to identify the nature of human brokenness. And the nature of human brokenness is found in a declaration of autonomy from the Creator. That's the nature of human brokenness. And so what I think that Genesis is trying to do is saying, where did it all get so screwed up? How did this beautiful creation and this wonderful relationship of man and woman together in a garden, called to tend and care for this garden, what the heck happened that got this thing so messed up? Where did the brokenness come from? Genesis 2 and 3 are trying to tell us a story about where that comes from. Is it just? It's kind of just the way it is. The sins of the father are visited upon the children. I'm screwed up because of my alcoholic father who abandoned me, and I'm screwed up because, heck, I was raised in North York. That'd screw up anybody. There's all kinds of forces in our lives that shape us. And Genesis is trying to get to the most grounding story about what's misshaped us, I think.
We're going to take one more question. And if there are ushers in the room, I want you to grab those comment cards. We do have comment cards. You're invited to fill them out. So they're going to be passed out.
There's going to be an offering too, right? That's how you're famous. Reach deep in your pocket.
No offerings tonight. We could, no. But the comment cards are going to go out. As they're going out, I want you to do two things, because we are a multitasking generation. I want you to listen to some announcements, but I also want you to think of at least one more good question to end on. I want to end on a question. So the comment cards are going to go out. You can leave them on your chairs when you're done filling them out. And I have a few announcements for you. Part of Jesus Who is an attempt to keep asking these kind of questions and having these conversations. One of the ways that that's going to happen is through a program called Campus Alpha. And the Christian groups are together working on Campus Alpha, offering it to the broader University of Guelph community. And it's going to be starting February 7th. It's a Thursday night, and it's going to be in the UC. There are sign-ups for Campus Alpha. Sorry, it's going to be in McKinney. There are sign-ups, but if you want to talk to someone about Alpha tonight, there are Jesus Who yellow shirts around. I see yellow. There might be other colors too. And people like myself, you're welcome to come up to and know more about Alpha. I also want to highlight two additional events while these comment cards are going out. First off, tomorrow night in War Memorial Hall, Ruxy Cavey is coming to speak on Jesus as the Way. And he's going to be speaking at 7:30 tomorrow night. On Thursday night, also in War Memorial Hall at 7:30 p.m., there's an event called Why Follow Jesus, or Why Bother Following Jesus? And it's going to be student answers to that question. And so you're invited to come out to that event as well. Both nights is a week full of activities. And just a heads up, there is a Bake Naan sale coming up on Thursday. Every group on campus sells cookies and baked goods. We've gathered hundreds of cookies from churches, and we're giving them away in the UC. So if you're hungry Thursday, stop by for some cookies and baked goods. But on that note, as you're looking at your comment cards, I do want to invite that last question to come forward. And Jolene's got it. She's fast.
Before you were talking about like justice in the context of sexual perpetrators, and so I was just wondering, like, if God's justice applies to them, like, what does that look like, or how is justice served out in that context?
Did you hear at the back? So the question is about sexual offenders and how what does God's justice look like in relation to,
or like how is that even just, like, justice?
How is it just?
All, like saying that I don't know, forgiving that, or like,
okay,
or saying that justice applies or is equal for them.
So how can the forgiving a sexual offender and saying that sexual offenders also need justice, how is that just?
I read a story once about the trials after the war, and there was a guy that was held in a concentration camp, and he was brought in to be a witness against the people that had killed his family. So the guy in charge of his concentration camp, and he was at the front in the chair facing, the courtroom, and this witness was being brought in. His family had been murdered. Every injustice had been done to this man, and he walked in, looked in the man's eyes who had done this to his family, and he wept. And he said, when I looked at him, I realized that I was capable of the same things he was, because he's a human being. When I was talking about me finding justice sitting across the table, I realized what I'm capable of when I sit across from somebody else. When I realized that God made that person in his image, that's when I found the justice. I'm not saying what they did was just, not at all. And they do have to answer to God. but realizing that I myself am capable of great atrocity and horrible things, and finding Christ in someone that has done horrible things is where I found justice in it.
When the year of Jubilee was instituted, the question was never, and so you're going to forgive debts. The question was never asked, well, what if this guy was stupid and squandered his money and ended up in debt? Question's never asked. The question is, the only issue is, will we forgive debts? We don't forgive those who are worthy of forgiveness because nobody is. Nobody's worthy of forgiveness. So I think we also have to then ask ourselves, what do we mean by justice? You know, there is great screaming right now in Brazil for obvious reasons, and people want justice. They want justice to be done against those people who allowed that fire to happen that killed more than 200 people in a nightclub. They want justice. And what they mean by justice is they want blood. That is a natural human reaction. The scandal, the utter scandal of the cross of Jesus Christ is that that's the only place the blood can be poured. That's the scandal. That God says, only here, no other blood. If you want to shed blood, shed the blood of my beloved Son. That's the only place. So then justice is not a matter of retribution, but justice is a matter of restoration. So the folks in urban ministry who, man, they are the superstars in my universe, are the people who work with something called circles of care. And they work with sex offenders. And they engage in a ministry where they have high levels of accountability relationships with sex offenders, but they want to, within those relationships of accountability, they want to help sex offenders experience some wholeness, some healing in their lives, some restoration. And that means they're going to live somewhere. So they need to have a community. They might need to have a church. And all that needs to happen in the context, of course, of protecting the vulnerable. Justice is about protecting the vulnerable. You know, so I remember talking to Brian McLaren once, and in his church in Washington, D.C., he had 2 sex offenders, both of whom had come to him and said, Brian, I want to come to your church, but I must never be alone in your church with anybody. Not children, not anybody. I must always be supervised. Would you please set it up that I can come to church and always be supervised? And the answer was, of course, we'll find a way to give you that opportunity to experience the healing of being in the community. Yeah. That is really, really tough stuff. You know, I'm not speaking as a man who's had a daughter sexually abused, you know. So maybe it's hard for me to say what I just said. It'd be awfully more hard, of course, if something like this had been really closer to me than it has. You got Bruxy Cavey coming, eh? He's nowhere near as cool as me and Kevin. I'm just saying.
On that note, I'm going to just invite us all to give a round of applause to Brian and Kevin. Thank you so much for coming, and you're invited to hang around for a while if you want and chat, but thanks for coming as well.